Well, thank you all very much for coming. I think this is the biggest crowd I've seen for a poetry event since I've been in Hong Kong, so I think that's terrific. Sarah's been very busy for the past, how long have you been here? A day and a half? Less than that?
Yesterday morning I arrived.
Yesterday morning, all right. So she's hardly had a moment to herself. So I'm going to give her a chance to compose herself for a minute and start with a little bit of background. Just about a year ago, the local director of Penguin Random House sent a book to me, which he said was a new poetry book, a new poetry collection from a Hong Kong-born poet, and it's really hard to find reviewers for poetry. So I thought I better do this one by myself. It turned out to be really rather good, so it was. I won't say to my surprise, but it was really very good, and I hadn't, to my chagrin, heard of the poet before. And there were two things in my review which I'll just kind of leave in your minds as we go through this. And the first one is that poetry is something that most of us probably did at school, and usually you kind of liked it when you were in secondary school. And then you kind of leave school and you never read poetry ever again, right? So maybe this will be a chance for you to restart. Well, if you're my age, you restart. If you're still in school, you can continue doing it. To look at poetry once again. And then the second thing that occurred to me is this question which those of us who talk about literature a lot ask ourselves, is there such a thing as Hong Kong literature? And if there is, what is it? And what does it mean for there to be Hong Kong literature in English and as opposed to Hong Kong literature in Chinese or Chinese literature, things like that? What are the differences between all of these things? And maybe by the end of the session today, we'll have a bit of an answer to that question. So all of this was a year ago, and it was too late for last year's book fair, but we started to communicate, and in the meantime, Sarah spent a year at the other Cambridge in the United States. And then, in December, she won the Young Writer of the Year Award, which is given out by the Sunday Times and a number of other people, which I forgot. And then a month or so later, she won the T.S. Eliot Prize, which is sort of like the Man Booker Prize for poetry, I think is the best way to describe it. And it was the first time that a debut collection had won it. So I think now she's here. How about that? So I think we start, maybe you could tell us a little bit about how you ended up here, sort of round trip, Hong Kong to England and then back again.
Well, I suppose the answer to that would involve explaining how my parents ended up here. If it's not strange to leap back a generation. My dad is English. He was born in East London, but he swapped the UK for Hong Kong, originally for work opportunities. He worked in insurance, and he came over here to work for a company called Jardine, which I know will be a name very familiar here, not least because it goes back to the very earliest colonial phases of Hong Kong, and so has a sort of symbolism in its own right. My mum is Hong Kong Chinese. She was born in 1948 in Guangdong province, and was abandoned by her birth family. I suppose we'll never really know why, but probably because she was a girl and probably because they couldn't afford to look after her. And then she was taken in by a woman who even my mother never really knew that much about, even though she lived with her for all of those years. She was sort of tenuously adopted by this woman and taken across the water to Hong Kong Island. I guess starting to think about this question of what is Hong Kong literature. The reason it so fascinates me is because I guess Hong Kong is a relatively new sort of place, isn't it? And so when we start to trace its history back, everyone who lives here is ultimately from somewhere else. And I guess that somewhere else is often mainland China, but that somewhere else might also be all sorts of different ports and locations across the globe, whether Europe or South Asia or further afield. And so I guess I feel like the meeting of my parents is a sort of Hong Kong story. And so my story is a Hong Kong story too, even though I was 7 when my family moved to England. And so I didn't spend the rest of my childhood here. But I still feel a real connection to Hong Kong, a real emotional connection here.
I think we'll start with a poem now, which tells that story, doesn't it? They've given us 2 different microphones, so
I think the point of this microphone is to let me turn the pages more easily. So
it's a long poem. It's not on one page.
It does involve a couple of page turns. This is a poem called Crossing from Guangdong, and I wrote it about 10 years ago, so it's one of the very earliest poems in the book, and it comes early in the book because I feel like it marks the start of a symbolic journey for me. And in this case, the literal journey was a bus ride that I made as a tourist in my early 20s when I took the road from Guangzhou to Hong Kong. And I felt some sort of obscure need to make that crossing in the way that my mother had at a few months old, and in the way that so many Hong Kong people did in the decades to come, sometimes in quite fraught circumstances. It felt like a pilgrimage for me to home, except with an added strangeness that home in this case was a place where I hadn't lived for most of my life. And this poem has been floating around in my head for the last couple of days because that view approaching Hong Kong's main island by land and seeing the skyscrapers swim up on the horizon, which is how this poem concludes, is exactly the view that I saw yesterday morning when I was driven in the taxi from the airport. And every time I see it, something in my heart just swells. So this poem is called Crossing from Guangdong. Something sets us looking for a place. For many minutes every day, we lose ourselves to somewhere else. Even without knowing, we are between the enveloping sheets of a childhood bed, or crossing that bright, willow-bounded weir at dusk. Tell me, why have I come? I caught the first coach of the morning outside the Grand Hotel in town, wheeled my case through the silent, still dark streets of the English Quarter, the funereal stonework facades with the air of Whitehall or the Cenotaph, but planted on Earth's other side. Here, no sign of life save for street hawkers, solicitous, arranging their slatted crates, stacks of bamboo steamers, battered woks, to some familiar inward plan. I watch the sun come up through tinted plexiglass. I try to sleep, but my eyes snag on every flitting tubular tree, their sword-like leaves. Blue metal placards at the roadside, their intricate, brooch-like signs in white that no one disobeys. I am looking for a familiar face. There is some symbol I am striving for. Yesterday, I sat in a cafe while it poured, drops like warm clots colliding with the Perspex gunnel roof. To the humid strains of Frank Sinatra, unexpectedly strange, I fingered the single glossy orchid. Couldn't decide if it was real. I picked at anemic bamboo shoot, lotus root like the plastic nozzle of a watering can, oversauced, not like you would make at home. I counted out the change in Cantonese. Yat, yi, sam, say. Like a baby. The numbers are the scraps that stay with me. I hear again your voice, firm at first, then almost querulous, asking me not to go. I try to imagine you as a girl. A street of 4-story plaster buildings, carved wooden doors, weathered, almost shrines, like in those postcards of old Hong Kong you loved. You, a child in bed, the neighbours always in and out, a terrier dog, half-finished bowls of rice, the ivory mahjong tablets clacking like joints swift and mechanical, shrill cries, "Ayah!" late into the night. My heart is bounded by a scallop shell. This strange pilgrimage to home. The bus sinks with a hydraulic sigh. So, we have crossed the imaginary line. The checkpoint is a concrete pool. The lichen green uniformed official with his hat brimmed in black gloss, his elegant white-gloved hands, his holstered gun, slowly mounts the rubbered steps, sways with careful elbows down the aisle. I lift this crease-marred passport, the rubbed gold of the lion crest, a mute offering. 2 fingers brace the pliant spine, the thumb at the edge, an angle exact as a violinist's wrist, flicking through stamps to halt at the last laminated side. He lifts his eyes to read my face. They flicker his uncertainty as he makes out eyes, the contour of a nose. Half recognition. These bare moments. Something like finding family. The mild waitress in Beijing, your mother, China worker? She asked at last after many whispers spilling from the kitchen. Or the old woman on the Datong bus, doubtless just inviting a foreigner to dinner, but who could have been my unknown grandmother, for all I knew or understood. She took a look at me and reached up to grasp my shoulders, loosing a string of frantic, happy syllables in what dialect I don't even know. She held my awkward hands, cupped in her earthenware palms, until the general restlessness showed we neared the stop. As the doors lurched open, she smiled, pressed a folded piece of paper, blue biro, spidery signs between my fingers, then joined in the procession shuffling off. Some, I realized then, were in hard hats as they dwindled across the empty plain, shadowed by the blackened, soaring towers of the mine. Something sets us looking for a place. Old stories tell that if we could only get there, all distances would be erased. Wheels brace themselves against the ground, and we are on our way. Soon we will reach the fragrant city, the island rising into mist, where silver towers forest the invisible mountain across that small span of cerulean sea. I have made the crossing, the same journey you, a screaming baby, made sometime in 1949, or year one of the fledgling People's State. And what has changed? The near empty bus says enough. And so, as we approach, stop-start by land, that once familiar scene, the warm, phthalo-green South China tide, I can make out rising mercury pin tips, distinct against the blue as the outspread primaries at the edge of a bird's extending wing, so much taller now than when I left 15 years ago. Suddenly, I know, from the mid-levels flat where I grew up, set in the bamboo grove, from the kumquat-lined windows on the 25th floor, tinted to bear the condensation's glare, you can no longer see the insect cars circling down those jungle-bordered boulevards. The low-slung ferry, white above green, piloting the harbour's carpet of stars, turned always home, you can no longer see.
You know, poetry is a funny thing. I listen to that, and I hear Robert Frost. That's where I grew up, you know, and I was lucky enough to hear him read once when I was very young. I know you've met people since the book came out, and you might talk a little bit about the effect it's had on other people. There was that marvelous article in The Guardian from Emily Moss, for example.
Oh, yes. No, that's very true. I guess I don't know how well Emma Lee Moss is known in Hong Kong. She's a singer-songwriter who's really, really well known these days in the UK and much beloved. And her stage name is Emmy the Great. And actually, I suppose our meeting was a little bit like the way that we met, Peter, in the sense that I had followed Emmy's music for many years, even, I think, just from the point when her first album came out. Her third album is out now. And I loved her music, but I was also intrigued by the fact that she is also, like me, Eurasian. And indeed, we were both born in Hong Kong in 1983 to English fathers and Chinese mothers. And we both moved to England midway through our childhoods. And indeed, both settled in suburbs of London and spent our teen years there. And so I sort of felt this immediate connection with her. And so when my book came out, I thought, oh, what can I lose? I'll send it to her and see what happens. And what happened was that I gained a tremendous friend, an amazingly perceptive reader, and someone who I felt had been travelling a strangely parallel path to myself for the last few years. It's actually uncanny to hear Emma talking about her own relationship to Hong Kong and her Chinese identity. I suppose there's a difference between us in as much as Emma does actually speak Cantonese. Her mum spoke to her in Cantonese, and she went to a Chinese medium school in Hong Kong. But when she moved to England, she described a sensation that was utterly familiar to me of sitting up one day in the school canteen and realizing that in order to survive this, she was going to need to button up her Chineseness and put it away somewhere down there because she needed to be English now. And I I remember doing exactly the same thing, because I suppose that can be what assimilation demands of immigrants, and particularly immigrant children who want nothing more than to fit in, even in the midst of a playground where people are asking you if you speak Hong Kongese and doing slitty eyes and making fun of the way that Chinese people sound when they speak. And I feel like that trajectory was something that, for me, continued all the way through my teenage years and into university. So I studied English literature at university. There was absolutely no question at my school, English school, that you would learn Chinese. It wasn't even an option at that time. And it genuinely didn't occur to me to study Chinese literature at university, though now I really regret not having done so. And so not only did I perfect the art of watching everyone else to learn how to fit in, I became almost even more English than the English. You know, I became an expert in Renaissance English literature. My day job now is to teach Shakespeare. I teach English students Shakespeare. And I think that was almost a mechanism of psychic protection for me in some ways, that, you know, people wouldn't be able to question my credentials at all. I would be unquestionably English. And so poetry had a strange relationship for me in all of this. When I first moved to England and went to this primary school outside London, one of the teachers, I think she was being kind, set me a special exercise, which was to memorize a poem by the Victorian English poet Robert Browning called Home Thoughts from Abroad. I don't know if any of you know this poem, but it's in its own wistful way, it's sort of beautiful, but also rather jingoistic, in as much as it's Robert Browning, who was living in Italy at that time, thinking back to England and how beautiful its landscape is, how much better its buttercups are with their yellow modesty than the gaudy melon flower you find in southern Europe or in the tropics. It's a version of homesickness which is about saying how much better England is than anywhere else. And so I think it was, my teacher was being sort of kind in setting me the homework of memorizing this poem and reciting it in front of the class. But it was almost like she was giving me a message that, you know, you, child from the tropics, English buttercups are better. And so I always loved poetry, but I was also aware of the sort of, shall we say, the power dynamics of the British canon. And so to bring us back to Emmy the Great, I think what we both discovered in our mid-20s, say, was that we were fed up with denying this other half of ourselves. I wanted to understand what it means to be half Chinese. I wanted to reconnect with my Chineseness, with my roots. And so I started to come back to Hong Kong and China a lot. I did a lot of traveling in the Chinese mainland. I spent spells of time back here in Hong Kong, and I wrote these poems. And in the process, began to answer this question, who am I and where did I belong? And actually, Emmy, in her latest album, Second Love, she has a beautiful song which is about home. And although we didn't know each other when she was writing that song and when I was writing these poems, I feel like we were almost asking the same questions and turning to art to answer them.
It's not such an unusual experience here, of course. People like that. Could you read another one? Could we do islands?
Absolutely. So, in crossing from Guangdong, there were all these moments of me sort of looking to poor, innocent Guangdong and Hong Kong people and sort of projecting my own need for family onto them. And I confess I do have this strange sensation when I come to this part of the world. I'll be in a crowd on the MTR and everybody looks so much like my mum that I'll see an older woman from behind and I'll think that it is my mother, even though I know that she's back home in England. And I think this sensation for me is to do with feeling like everyone here does somehow look like my mother, to the extent that they could potentially be my long-lost Chinese family, who I will never be able to know because of the circumstances of my mum's adoption being so impossible to trace. I mean, it was the sort of informal adoption where there would be no paper trail. And so this next poem, Islands, is based like a couple of the other poems in this book on the stories that my mum told me about her early childhood, what it was like for her to grow up with this woman who took her in but didn't quite know how to love her, partly because I think she hadn't really been loved herself. She had had an extremely difficult childhood too. My mum doesn't know very much about her background, except she suspects that she was probably sold by her own family who couldn't afford to look after her. So my mum was telling me these stories about her early life, and when her mother couldn't afford to look after her because they were very poor, she would sometimes send her to live with other families who could afford to look after her. And she also sent her for many years to a boarding school in Macau. Except that I think boarding school in English is almost the wrong translation for what that place was. Boarding school, to my ear, means something like Eton. It means a place of immense social privilege and wealth. Whereas, as you'll hear from this poem, that school was not that place. And this poem works round to an image that particularly stuck in my mind's eye and heart when my mum told it to me late at night one day, that her mother, they sublet their living space in Hong Kong from another family who held the main let, and there was so little space that my mum would sleep in a storage chest that had been opened up with the clothes of the main family, the winter clothes that had been moth-proofed. She would sleep in that chest. And from that vantage point, she would look out over the other family's ancestral shrine and see the photographs and see the joss sticks and see the glow of the candles. And she just described this to me in a very straightforward, simple way, with no particular sadness, no pathos. But I felt a huge sadness at it, because what that image meant to me was that she fell asleep each night in front of a shrine about worshipping someone else's ancestors, but could never know her own. And in a Confucian culture where your lineage, your ancestors, is in some ways everything, what does that mean for people who don't have that connection? What does it mean that I will never be able to set up a shrine for my own Chinese family in that way? So this is called Islands. Oh, and it's probably obvious, but if it's not exactly in the voice of my mother, it's in the voice of a character very like my mother. So this isn't my own voice. Islands. At the boarding school, we used to chant them. Ping Chao, Chang Chao, Lan Chao, Lama. I rolled their sounds around my mouth till they were strange again, like savouring those New Year candies, small translucent moons waning on the tongue, wrapped in packages from home that never came. This was called geography, for knowing where we are and names of fixed and distant things. The words came back to me like dreams, sometimes only that insistent rhythm, the rocking of the rope-prowed ferry every minute further from Macau, that Isle of Lotuses. My feet slipping on the wet wood deck, stretching up to feel the terseness in the air, to catch the islands swim like mist on the horizon. Passing fish huts perched like spindly seabirds, foaming lacework, whispering into nothing on the rocks. My heart was drowning, the long-anticipated sight of home. In the early years, we slept 3 small girls to each shelf of the beds, like dumplings stacked in steamers, someone said. Each night, lifting the stout, sculpted planks one at a time off the iron bed frame, knuckles tight. Without a word, we let each end thud heavy on the ground, as though pounding red beans into paste. The lice went running. We squashed them with our sandaled feet, but many got away. We lay beneath that charcoal blanket, too heavy for the torpid summers, colour of the August harbour in the rains. We lay together, breathing in that odour, sea drizzle, diesel, damp black hair. In October, typhoon season dwindles. Washed out stars suspended in the puddles where our faces floated by, white bellies of dead fish. That year, before mid-autumn came, we learned to write. Haltingly, I penned the crescent strokes of combinations from the board. It seemed a ladder to the heavens, leading up and off the yellowed page. The faded grid of squares grew fainter. The desk beneath my hand was pocked and battered like the surface of the moon. That afternoon was following Chang'e, her story. One day, through curiosity, she swallowed down a bright pill hidden in a box, Ho Yi's elixir of immortality. As he watched in horror, she floated off into the thinning blue. Her long sleeves trailed like cloud around a mountaintop, the moon at first a pill, and then a swelling pearl in the dark mouth of the sky. He couldn't bear to shoot her down with his star-felling bow. She lives there, cold and lonely now. You can see her if you look. I often did, waiting for the shadowed moon to rise into the window frame, a pale, dependable friend. It took my mother many months to eat the gifts of mooncakes, 4 cloud-encrusted islands drifting in their silver tin. She would take a slice each afternoon with cups of wine, the kind we heated in a beaten kitchen pan. An autumn treat accompanied by cooling evenings, too rich for more habitual food. She cut into the patterned casing, full moon, half moon, quarter moon. I loved the unexpected orb inside, a golden yolk set in a firmament of lotus paste. They glowed like all those tiny suns trapped in lanterns at the festival, speared on slim red candles. Their charring wicks were cedars twisted in the wind. I had a paper globe. Its redness smouldered like a burnt-out star. Other children had the shapes of animals, crimson cellophane on wired frames, the undulating waves of dragons, sharp-beaked cranes, all in profile like the oval forms of fish. In the blackness of Victoria Park, their skin was gleaming gelatin, the hatching chrysalids of ghostly moths. A single silver sequin marked each winking convex eye, the ruby stain of lamplight over water. Fish lines trailed from them, metallic ribbons. Some fluttered off like slanting rain to settle in the shriveled grass. The procession trod them in the moonlit dust. The first thing I remember is the sickly pungency of camphor. My mother hired me a bed space in the thin partitioned tenement we shared with other families, one of many. It was summer. Sweltering in the box space of her plastered room, its single grime-barred window, heat poured over us in humid troughs like the bilge of a tropical sea. She lay on the floor, stiffly, in the keel shadow of the bed. I fanned her, cross-legged from the doorway. There was no other place. The elastic in my underwear had gone. The swishing fan was mouthing something in the dark, its silent arc the wafting arms of underwater weeds. Her shiny face was deep into the light-poured, drowning world of sleep. I was 4, perhaps, or 3, small enough to fit into the open wooden storage chest out in the hallway, freighted with that resinous scent of aromatic lumber clinging to the moth-proofed folded winter clothes of the family who held the let. It made a child-sized bed. My dreams were diving through the fisheye glow of 4 electric candle bulbs, their redness hesitating on the finely spiraled filaments, the sidelights of a far-off ship, or the microscopic coal flecks of the barely smoking joss sticks, sweet to pacify the spirit tenants of their ancestral shrine, the crinkled Polaroids half settled in the sand, their hungering voices. I slept inside my treasure chest, baby Moses flowing through the water meadows. She was always taking in abandoned things. I think she saw her sadnesses reflected in them. Once it was a stray puppy. She gave him to me, but the next day, fawning absently, gifted him to strangers. Some years later, in her violent anger, I learned it was the same with me. A Guangdong cobbler's foundling daughter. She said she saved me from the refuse heap, from being eaten by the dogs with other scraps. Too many mouths to feed. I never wondered about these unknown siblings, or my father's blackened hands turning the warm hide of a fraying shoe beneath his hammer, or my real mother, unreachable across the water as planets circling in the night.
I think we'll do some questions from the floor now. People have there's one right at the back.
Thank you very much. I really feel your empathy with everything. Oh, sorry. Your empathy with everything that's so symbolic of Chineseness, Chinese culture. And I've just taken a few notes because I think your emotions are so deeply attached to the sense of loss in many ways because of your mother's background. I heard from your first poem that towards the end, although you were talking about turning towards home, although you were talking about turning towards home, yet you ended with a line about that world being invisible now. So to me, it's like the sadness still there, and I hope you find, happiness. And I mean, I'm Chinese myself, but I'm from Fujian, ancestral. I'm sort of very British as well. So I can connect with your sense of identity at a very deep level. But at the same time, it's not the only kind of poetry that speaks about, that relates the identity of oneself to one's nation or country. Because I think there are so many other different layers. And when you were talking about being an immigrant, somehow I felt that you were sort of perhaps from another period of colonialism. I watched a film on the plane yesterday, just last night, and it was written, it's a modern story written by an English bloke. And he met a Chinese girlfriend, and they were sort of sharing some funny, amusing, not serious conversations. At one point, one of them, could be either of them, said, "Oh yeah, you're great, you're a Westerner, so you're always an expat. Whereas we in Canada or America are immigrants because we're from Asia." So I think there's some salient points in a postmodernist world when, the world that you talk about in your Loop of Jade, which is very beautiful, it's somewhat I can feel but don't relate to at the same time.
Oh,
I don't know if you will bring it forward, and if you do, I don't know what you'll be concentrating on.
thank you. That's really, really beautiful, and I find that very moving. Thank you for sharing that with me. I guess I didn't have much of a sense when I was writing this book of whether the poems would resonate with people in Hong Kong. I didn't even have a sense of whether they would resonate with British Chinese people, which I guess is the group I would probably most readily identify myself with. And so it was sort of surprising to me, but perhaps it shouldn't have been surprising that in London, where I would always do lots of poetry readings, and elsewhere in the country, I noticed that Chinese people, especially young women, started to come to my readings. And the bravest ones, though I tried to be encouraging, would come and talk to me afterwards. And they said many things, but one of the common themes was, I'm so glad that there's someone writing about these experiences, because maybe it's hard to imagine if you haven't spent time in the UK, which I suppose much of this room might have, but as a British Chinese person, you can often feel utterly invisible in the culture. There's hardly any, say, TV personalities or politicians, or I guess the closest we get to British Chinese celebrities is maybe our celebrity chefs. And so there are very few people to look at and say, oh, that's how I could model myself on that. That's someone I could model myself on. That's an example of how to be someone who looks like me in this world. And actually, I think that that's something that is true of literature in England and the UK too, that you have young immigrant readers, whether of Asian backgrounds or South Asian or Eastern European or African, Caribbean, who are learning to read in English and aren't finding themselves reflected in the books that they read, that there's nobody who looks like them in the storybooks. And I'm glad that writers are trying to change that at the moment, because I think it's really important. Because, of course, empathy, and I'm glad you used that word, is a very, very important quality. And I deeply believe that literature one of its most important tasks is to foster empathy and the ability to feel emotion with and for people who are not like yourself. But it's also true that if you read books and you don't find reflected in them anyone who looks like you, what's the point of reading the books? You would feel, I suppose, like you were excluded from them, like you were barred from their world. The Dominican-American novelist Junot Diaz once said that the fastest way to make someone feel like a monster is not to provide them with any mirrors for themselves in the culture. And so he says that his work as a Latino novelist in America is to provide some mirrors for people like him. And I guess I feel like that's what I'm trying to do in my work as well, to provide some of those mirrors.
But I also feel that you have a very deep empathy with the English culture, feelings. Oh, so sorry. I thought I'm loud enough. I think also, I feel your very deep empathy with the Englishness of things in your poetry, your metric lines, your allusions and feelings. They're all very English.
I think that's true.
I feel very strongly about that, yes.
I think that is true because my education was largely English. I mean, my reference points, if I hadn't tried hard, would have been completely English. And so, both of those poems are written in a loose iambic pentameter line. They're written in the line that in blank verse, effectively, in the poetic form that Shakespeare pioneered for us. And yeah, that's something that does leave its mark on the poems. But I like to think that it's not an unself-conscious gesture. I've made real efforts over the years to engage with Chinese poetry, and increasingly, since I've learnt Mandarin in the last few years, in the originals as well, cack-handed and slow as my efforts at translation are.
Another question? In the front?
I'll shout. Congratulations. Congratulations on the book, Sarah. I know it can be tremendously cathartic to finally get a book out which helps you to really eviscerate the kind of conflicting identities that you may feel. I think also sometimes that some people might expect you to continue doing this. To what extent do you feel that having written it and having gotten it published has allowed you to make peace with yourself and your family traditions? And what do you plan to do afterwards? What do you plan to write about?
That's a very perceptive observation, actually. I do feel like some of the questions that were driving me to write this book, while I haven't exactly resolved them, I've sort of managed to lay them to rest for the moment. So I do feel like there needs to be a new beginning in my writing, but I'll admit that at the moment I feel like I'm just sort of open to the wind. I'm waiting to be tugged by something unignorable down a new path, but I'm not exactly sure what that path is going to be. I've been writing new poems here and there. I've been writing some poems about theoretical physics. I've been writing poems about factory workers in China. I've been writing poems about the rain in London. How all of that will fit together in the coming years, I wouldn't dare to speculate yet. But I wouldn't want to close down any paths either. I guess I wouldn't say to myself, you're not allowed to write about Hong Kong anymore. You're not allowed to write about X or Y or Z.
Question there? Just by the TV camera there?
Hi, thank you very much for your talk. Continuing on the theme of mirrors, I found it really interesting when I heard your poem Islands, because it particularly made me think about translation and because that's sort of a translation of it gave me a really, the immediacy of your mother's voice and her experiences really struck me, and it's really interesting how. Although there was a sort of directness in the way that your mother's experiences came across, it's really apparent that it's a translation and that it's sort of a bit jarring because obviously of your mother's Chinese experience and Chinese upbringing being voiced in a sort of very distinctly British voice. And so I was wondering what sort of your relationship with translation would be. Are you sort of thinking of publishing poems in Chinese once you've mastered it? Because I found it especially interesting because having studied sort of translation theories and some translation theories proposing that translations are always going to be inferior to the original, especially in this circumstance where England was a former colonial power, sort of ruling Hong Kong. So that itself, if it's being translated, might be seen as a sort of inferior product. So I was wondering what your relationship with translation was.
Gosh, that's a really rich set of issues, and you're absolutely spot on about that poem in a way that I think maybe is a bit harder for English readers to tune into. Thank you. I'm glad that you have said that because I'm not sure that anyone has ever articulated that to me before, and that was something that I was trying very hard to do in that poem, to capture this slight feeling of translationese, that it's not exactly English, but that you are having this sense of reaching behind it to the original thoughts which aren't exactly coming out perfectly. And I guess that was something that I was very interested in that poem and also in the title poem, which is called, like the book, Loop of Jade, which dwells at much greater length on this issue of mistranslation. My mum's English is actually really, really good, especially considering that she only speaks English because a university student volunteered one summer at her boarding school and taught them the rudiments of phonetic reading in English, enough that she could effectively teach herself the language from that point. So she has a sort of amazing fluency in many ways. Though not always a very good sense of register. So she'll sometimes use like very unfamiliar or long words because she's read them in a book and she might not pronounce them exactly right, but I think this is a tendency that autodidacts around the world probably share. But Loop of Jade, that poem, dwells on moments like the one I talked about earlier of boarding school, that English word is somewhat misleading or inadequate to the thing actually being described in the other culture. And actually another word that I noticed in my mum's speech patterns where there was also a sort of hesitation is every time she says my mother, she hesitates as if that's the word that she can find for the moment, but it's not the right one to describe her relationship with that woman, who couldn't, for all those reasons, be really a mother to her. And so I guess that particular point is one that also speaks to this problem of translation, but maybe speaks to the adequacy of language, full stop, any language, which is the terrain that poets always want to dwell in. You always want to be pushing up against the edges of what language will let you do. As to whether I'm interested in translation and translation theory myself and in future work, I have never actually written any translations of Chinese poetry, partly because my Mandarin is only good enough really to let me work through a crib intermediary translation. So I don't have much of a sense for nuance or diction at all. I have to work really painstakingly with a dictionary to get anything. And so I don't really feel secure unless I have at the very, very least, a prose version of a poem that I can work through beforehand. So I guess I don't feel sort of secure enough in my own language abilities to really translate from Chinese. Funnily enough, and this is more evidence of my Western biases in my education, my best foreign language remains Latin. So that might be a more logical candidate for a language to translate from for me. And in fact, I feel like some of these versions are sort of poems are sort of versions of some Latin poets I love very much. There's a poem in this book called Tame, which has a series of moments where people transform into trees or into geese. And this comes straight out of the Roman poet Ovid. And so I feel like my interests in culture and cross-cultural contact lead me to write poems that are often responding to poems of the past. And this was especially true of Ezra Pound, who comes up many times in Loop of Jade in different guises, because I was fascinated by Pound's Cathay versions of Li Bai and others. And I was fascinated by what it meant for him to write those with so many levels of mediation. You know, not only did he not speak Chinese, but he was working through Ernest Fenollosa's papers that were explaining these poems through the medium of a Japanese translator. So many removes. And yet, even for all their inaccuracies and mistakes, they sort of set the idiom for what Chineseness means in the English language, in English poetry. And so it felt very important to sort of grapple with that. So I suppose my interest in translation and imperfection and mediation sort of came out of Pound in lots of ways.
I'm going to ask you to read one more, if we have a minute. But this one is one that isn't Chinese. Maybe the short one, The Walled Garden. Can you do that? Something different.
Speaking of poems that write back to other poets, you don't really need to know this, but I think when I was writing this poem, I had some lines by the American poet Theodore Roethke going round and round in my head. They go something like, "Snail, snail, glister me forward, bird, soft sigh me home, worm, be with me, this is my hard time." And I think they're very beautiful. This poem is actually set in Cambridge, UK, where I lived for many years. The Walled Garden. Across the road, the girls quit school in 3s and 4s, tripping off at speed to stations or familiar cars, their silhouettes slung with shoulder bags and hockey sticks like mules. "Remember," says the afternoon. The shut door shudders brassily beneath my hand. It is already dark or darkening. That sky above the dimming terraced rows goes far beyond a child's imagining. I tread along the back street where the cabs cut through behind the luminous science labs. Their sills of spider plants in yogurt pots among the outsized glassware cylinders like pygmies contemplating monoliths. You cannot walk the other side because the walled garden meets the road direct. In pools of spangled tarmac after rain, the open gutter choking up with leaves. As though to listen, the colossal trees lean out into the tungsten-haloed street. I meet another on the road. This snail's slow ribbon turns the asphalt into gold.
Being moderator means I get to ask a question. Do you mode switch between writing a poem like that, which is about England, and one which is about Hong Kong? Is your head in a different place?
That's a very interesting question. Mode switching. I suppose I love watching bilingual children, which of course I wasn't myself, doing that thing of speaking to one parent in one language and suddenly effortlessly, as if there were no shift happening at all, turning to the other and addressing them in the other language. I guess it's never felt as effortless for me as that. It was never natural. It was always a question of very deliberately shifting the focus. So, yeah, mode switching, code switching, but one that demanded turning the head. I suppose I had a much readier sense of how to write a poem like that one, because the English literary tradition teaches us how to do it. I guess that poem again that one's actually in a very strict metrical pattern. And that's something that I do turn to sometimes, traditional form. You can flick through the book and you'll see that the poems take place in almost a sort of dizzying variety of different shapes and architectures on the page. And that was something that was sort of quite self-conscious on my part, that I almost thought of the poems as being like an emperor's menagerie, that he would want a long thin one and a wide fat one and an elephant one and a mouse one and so on. But sometimes I do reach for more traditional shapes for poems. And I guess the sonnet, for example, as that classic container of thought in the Western tradition, is something that I've been reaching to quite a lot recently. There are several sonnets in this book. One of them is about reading Shakespeare, picking up my undergraduate copy of The Bard after many years of not flicking through that particular section and finding a fly squashed into it, which I think on some level I felt was almost emblematic of myself. And one of the other sonnets is about my own mixed marriage. My husband is Jewish, British Jewish, and so that sonnet is sort of a joke in some ways that occurred to me when it was our wedding ceremony, and we wanted to bring in elements that would reflect both our cultural heritages. So we smashed a glass at the end of the ceremony and shouted Mazel Tov. And I did a lot of reading into Chinese wedding customs, and it particularly made me laugh when I read about the one where the groom's family traditionally was supposed to send, I think, the bride's family a roast piglet after verifying, shall we say, her chastity. And this was just such a fantastically inapt thing for our particular nuptials, given that the smell of bacon makes my husband feel physically sick. So it was sort of a cross-cultural intermarriage sonnet.
There are books outside. If you'll stay and sign, won't you?
Yeah.
So I'd like to leave time for that. So maybe we'll take one more question. I saw one here. We'll break.
Thank you. So I'm very glad to be here today, and I'm also an English major in Hong Kong in the Chinese University of Hong Kong, and I'm really curious. I'm really fascinated with your book, like Loop of Jade. So for the first time I read this collection, very immediately I feel it has a very strong, sense of post-colonialism. So. For me, this collection is more like loss of identity and also like a search of identity. So my question is like, do you find your identity, or how will you identify yourself now, like a Hong Konger or British, or just a unique, kind of unique identity in between? Okay.
That's a really great question, and I suppose it brings us back again to the one that Peter posed at the start of the session. Sort of, am I a Hong Kong poet? I was born here. I don't live here anymore, though I suppose I wouldn't bar the possibility of living here again. I would very much like to, if work and family allowed. I guess I try not to label myself if I don't have to, but when people ask for biographies, I think they sort of expect you to. So I guess the label I seem to reach for most often these days is British Chinese. But I was really touched when Peter and David McCurdy recently invited me to be part of an anthology called 8 Hong Kong Poets. And that was moving to me because it suggested that this label Hong Kong poet is actually more capacious and more flexible than I had ever thought it was. It's not an honour that I would have sought to claim for myself. And so the fact that the literary community here sort of offered it to me, I think changed my sense of myself and my relationship to the place, but it also modified my sense of what a Hong Kong writer and maybe Hong Kong literature is, that maybe it's as diverse and transient or permanent or people from all over the place staying for different amounts of time in this place, that if they're touched by this place and write about it, then that's what Hong Kong literature is, and their sort of blood origins don't really matter so much. And I think that chimes with what I feel like I learnt from writing this book. So the book opens with an epigraph from a passage by the Argentine writer Jorge Luis Borges, which describes the entry on animals in a supposed Chinese encyclopedia, which of course isn't Chinese at all, but is a figment of Borges' imagination. And Borges in this essay describes the categories that this fictional encyclopedia divides the animals into, and they're ridiculous. They're things like belonging to the emperor, having just broken the water pitcher, included in the present classification, others, drawn with a very fine camel hair brush that from a long way off look like flies. So they're sort of utterly contradictory. How can you have a taxonomy that includes both things in the present classification and others? It's just nonsense. But the reason why that felt like an apt emblem for the whole book is because now, when I'm asked the question, do you feel like your background gave you your poetry? I flip it round, because I don't feel that. What I feel like is writing the poetry gave me my background. And I think that says something about the fluidity of identity, that it's actually more slippery and more flexible than we might think it is at first.
So maybe we can try to answer the question I asked at the beginning. If you feel you recognize these poems, how many people feel that these are Hong Kong poems? So raise hands. Well, it's about half. There we go, more than half. There you go. I think if people think that they're Hong Kong poems, then they're Hong Kong poems. I think, right? I think that's really the definition. I think we have copies of the anthology outside too, if people are interested in a wider range of things. I think we'll give you time to do some of that afterwards. So, thank you very much for coming. It's a very long way, and you're here for a few days, and you're being run off your feet, I know. But thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Peter, for your questions, and thank you to all of you for being here.